It is April 1972. The rain hammers down on the green hell of the Central Highlands. In a cave complex carved into the limestone mountains near Khe Sanh, a North Vietnamese Army intelligence officer named Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu sits before a flickering oil lamp, surrounded by maps and reports that make no sense. For 7 years, his analysts have been tracking American air operations. They have learned the patterns. The high-altitude B-52 bombers leave contrails and carpet bomb in predictable grid patterns. The F-4 Phantom jets scream in fast and loud, dropping their ordnance and vanishing. The slow A-1 Skyraider propeller planes are vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Every American aircraft has a weakness, a counter, a doctrine to defeat it. Except one. The reports flooding into his cave speak of something that defies every principle of aerial warfare they have been taught by their Soviet and Chinese advisors. They speak of an aircraft that flies below the tree line, an aircraft that appears without warning, hovers in place like a dragonfly, and kills with surgical precision. An aircraft that their ZPU anti-aircraft guns cannot track because it hides behind the terrain. An aircraft that does not behave like an airplane at all. The Soviets have a name for this category of machine, the vertolet, the helicopter. But the Americans have done something the Soviets did not anticipate. They have turned a transport aircraft into a weapon of war. Colonel Thieu spreads out a hand-drawn sketch recovered from a decimated NVA battalion. The sketch shows a strange insect-like silhouette, a thin tail boom, a bubble cockpit, stubby wings covered in rockets, and a minigun that fires so fast it sounds like a buzzsaw tearing through fabric. The sketch is labeled in desperate handwriting, Con Matroy, the Sky Devil. This is the Bell AH-1 Cobra, and it is hunting his men. The story of the attack helicopter does not begin with the Cobra. It begins with a problem that has plagued armies since the invention of the machine gun. How do you provide close air support to infantry without killing them? Traditional fixed-wing aircraft have a fundamental limitation. They are fast. A jet fighter traveling at 500 miles per hour over a battlefield has approximately 4 seconds to identify friend from foe, acquire a target, and release ordnance. In the chaos of close combat, where the enemy might be 50 meters from your own troops, this is an impossible task. The helicopter offered a radical solution. It could slow down. It could stop. It could hover in place and observe. It could loiter over a battlefield for hours, not minutes. But early helicopters were fragile, unarmed transport craft, flying coffins in a combat zone. The U.S. Army's first attempt to weaponize the helicopter was crude. In Vietnam's early years, door gunners would simply hang out the sides of UH-1 Huey transport helicopters, firing M60 machine guns. These gunships were better than nothing, but they were slow, unarmored, and presented a large target profile. Then, in 1965, Bell Helicopter took a Huey, removed everything that wasn't essential, narrowed the fuselage to the width of a phone booth, added stub wings for weapons, and created the first purpose-built attack helicopter, the AH-1 Cobra. It was not a transport that could fight. It was a fighter that could hover. The first NVA units to encounter Cobras in combat did not survive to file complete reports. What trickled back to Colonel Thieu's intelligence cell were fragments, scraps of radio transmissions, and the traumatized accounts of survivors. A company commander from the 304th Division reported that his unit, dug into a fortified tree line, was preparing to ambush an American convoy when the jungle behind them exploded. He described it as impossible. The attack came from their rear, from terrain they believed was impassable to aircraft. The Cobra had used the terrain itself as concealment, flying nap of the earth below the tree line, popping up only to fire, then disappearing again. His heavy machine gun teams, trained to track high-flying aircraft, could not depress their weapons fast enough. The Cobra was too close, too low, too fast. Another report described a night attack. NVA troops moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail heard a rhythmic thumping sound in the darkness. Then, without warning, streams of tracer fire rained down from above. The gunship was using infrared searchlights, invisible to the human eye, hunting them in total darkness while remaining unseen. The psychological effect was devastating. The NVA had learned to hide from high-altitude bombers by digging tunnels. They had learned to scatter when they heard jets approaching. But the helicopter could follow them to the tunnel's entrances. It could chase them through the jungle. It moved with them, hunted with them, killed with them watching. This was not an aircraft. This was a predator. When Colonel Thieu's reports reached Hanoi, and when Hanoi's reports reached Moscow, the initial Soviet reaction was dismissal. In a classified briefing room in Moscow's Frunze Military Academy, Soviet military theorists analyzed the early Cobra data with skepticism. The helicopter, according to decades of Soviet doctrine, was a transport vehicle. Its mission was to deposit troops and supplies, then leave the battlefield. The idea of a helicopter as a primary weapons platform was dismissed as American improvisation born from desperation. The Soviets had their own attack helicopter program, the Me-24 Hind, but it was conceived as a flying infantry fighting vehicle, a transport that could fight if necessary, not a dedicated hunter-killer. The Soviet philosophy was that helicopters were too vulnerable, too slow, and too expensive to be frontline weapons. But the reports from Vietnam kept coming, and they kept getting worse. A Soviet military advisor embedded with an NVA regiment filed what would become a legendary report in 1970. His unit had been caught in the open during a failed assault on Firebase Ripcord. He described being stalked by a pair of Cobras for over 3 hours. Every time his troops tried to move, the helicopters would reappear. They were not attacking randomly. They were coordinating, taking turns, one observing while the other rearmed and refueled. This was not a weapon. This was a tactic. This was a philosophy. The Soviet advisor's report concluded with a sentence that sent chills through the GRU. The Americans have invented a new type of cavalry, one that does not need roads or bridges, one that cannot be flanked, one that sees everything and fears nothing. By 1973, the Vietnam War was winding down, but in the deserts of the Middle East, a new war was about to validate the attack helicopter in a way no jungle skirmish ever could. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, Syrian armored divisions equipped with the latest Soviet T-62 tanks smashed across the Golan Heights. The Israeli defense forces, caught by surprise, were in danger of being overrun. Israeli tank crews, outnumbered 5-1, fought desperate delaying actions as they retreated toward the Sea of Galilee. Then, the Israeli Air Force deployed a new weapon. American-supplied AH-1 Cobras, equipped with TOW anti-tank guided missiles. The Syrian tank commanders had been trained by Soviet advisors. They understood air defense. They knew how to disperse their formations to avoid cluster bombs. They knew how to use ZSU-23-4 Shilka mobile anti-aircraft guns to create protective umbrellas. They were prepared for fighter bombers diving from 10,000 feet. They were not prepared for helicopters hiding behind ridgelines, firing guided missiles from 4 kilometers away. A Syrian tank battalion commander, later captured and debriefed, described the experience as surreal. His T-62 tanks were advancing in textbook formation when the first tank in his column simply exploded. There was no sound of an aircraft, no warning, just a sudden catastrophic kill. Then the second tank exploded, then the third. His column scattered, seeking cover, but there was none. The helicopters were firing from behind hills, using the terrain as a shield. His tanks could not see the enemy to return fire. His Shilka anti-aircraft vehicles tried to lock on, but the helicopters would drop below the ridgeline before missiles could be launched. In 3 hours, his battalion of 31 tanks was reduced to 7. The Israeli success on the Golan Heights sent shockwaves through both Washington and Moscow. The U.S. Army immediately accelerated its next-generation attack helicopter program. The Cobra had proven the concept. Now they would perfect it. In 1975, Hughes Helicopters began development of the AH-64 Apache. It was not an evolution of the Cobra. It was a complete reimagining of what an attack helicopter could be. The Apache was designed from the ground up to kill Soviet tanks on the plains of Central Europe. Every system, every weapon, every line of its angular, menacing shape was optimized for a single mission: find enemy armor, kill it from beyond visual range, and survive. The most revolutionary aspect of the Apache was not its weapons, it was its sensors. Mounted on the nose of the Apache was a Target Acquisition and Designation Site, TADS, a ball containing a thermal imaging camera, a television camera, a laser designator, and a laser rangefinder. This system allowed the Apache crew to see in total darkness, through smoke, through fog. It could detect the heat signature of a tank's engine from 8 kilometers away. But the true genius was in how the Apache used terrain. The helicopter could hover behind a hill with only the TADS ball exposed above the ridgeline. The crew, sitting safely behind cover, could observe an entire battlefield, select targets, and fire Hellfire missiles without ever exposing the main body of the helicopter to enemy fire. This technique, called masking, transformed the attack helicopter from a risky gunship into an almost invulnerable ambush predator. This was not combat. This was hunting. In a classified facility outside Moscow, Soviet helicopter designers were in a state of panic. The Mi-24 Hind, their pride and joy, was a beast of a machine, heavily armored, well-armed, and intimidating. But compared to what the Americans were building, it was a dinosaur. The Hind was large, loud, and carried a crew of 5 plus 8 combat troops. It was designed to land in a hot zone and fight alongside the infantry it had just delivered. It was a flying tank. The Apache was designed to never land near the enemy at all. It was a sniper. Soviet engineers understood the problem immediately. The Hind could not hover stably enough for precision firing. Its sensors were primitive compared to the Apache's TADS. Its AT-6 spiral anti-tank missiles were powerful, but required the helicopter to maintain a line of sight with the target throughout the entire flight, exposing it to counterfire. The American Hellfire missile was fire and forget. The Apache could fire, drop behind cover, and the missile would guide itself to the target using laser designation. A desperate modernization program began. The Mi-28 Havoc and Ka-50 Black Shark programs were accelerated. These were dedicated attack helicopters, sleek and deadly, designed to match the Apache. But they were still in development when events in a faraway desert would render the entire discussion academic. In January 1991, coalition forces began the air campaign against Iraq. But it was not jets that fired the first shots of DesertStorm. It was helicopters. On the night of January 17, 1991, 8 AH-64 Apache helicopters from the U.S. Army's 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment conducted the opening strike of the war. Their mission? Destroy 2 early warning radar sites deep inside Iraq, creating a blind spot through which coalition aircraft could pour into Iraqi airspace undetected. The Apaches flew 50 feet above the desert floor, in total darkness, navigating by GPS and terrain-following radar. Iraqi radar operators never saw them coming. At precisely 2:38 a.m., the Apaches unleashed 27 Hellfire missiles simultaneously. 11 seconds later, both radar sites and their supporting anti-aircraft batteries were obliterated. The door to Iraq was open. But this was just the beginning. For Soviet advisors still embedded with Iraqi units, the ground war phase of Desert Storm was not just a defeat. It was an apocalypse that rewrote everything they thought they knew about armored warfare. A Soviet colonel, assigned to Iraq's Tawakalna Republican Guard Division, filed what would become the most important intelligence report of his career. His division, equipped with Soviet T-72 tanks and supported by mobile SAM systems, had dug into defensive positions along the Iraqi-Saudi border. According to Soviet doctrine, they were impregnable. The tanks were hull down behind berms. The anti-aircraft missiles were networked and mobile. The infantry was well-trained and motivated. Then the Apaches arrived. The colonel described the attack as otherworldly. His division first became aware of the helicopters when tanks began exploding. Not from artillery, not from airstrikes, just sudden, catastrophic detonations. The crews reported seeing smoke trails, brief flashes from the darkness kilometers away, and then oblivion. The Iraqi T-72 gunners frantically scanned with their sights, but saw nothing. The Apaches were firing from beyond the maximum range of Iraqi tank guns, from behind terrain features, often from positions where the Iraqi crews couldn't even see them. One Iraqi tank commander reported something that chilled Soviet analysts. He claimed he was watching his thermal sight when a green box appeared around his tank. 3 seconds later, his tank was gone, vaporized by a hellfire. The Apaches' targeting computers were so advanced, they were painting targets visible even to the men about to die. In 10 hours of sustained combat, a single Apache battalion destroyed 84 Iraqi tanks, 120 armored vehicles, and 30 anti-aircraft systems. The battalion suffered 0 losses. What the Soviets did not understand, what Colonel Thieu in his Vietnamese cave had not understood, was that the Apache was never meant to fight alone. American doctrine had evolved something called the deep attack. Apache battalions would operate in coordinated wolf packs, supported by a network of sensors, scouts, and intelligence. OH-58 Kiowa scout helicopters would fly ahead, using their mast-mounted sights to peer over terrain and identify targets without exposing themselves. These scouts would data link target coordinates directly to the Apaches lurking kilometers behind. The Apaches themselves would operate in pairs, with designated shooter and cover roles. While one Apache engaged targets, the other would observe, ready to suppress any air defense that revealed itself. Behind them all, orbiting safely 50 miles from the battlefield, an E-8 Joint Stars aircraft would watch the entire battlefield with ground-scanning radar, feeding real-time intelligence about enemy movements. This was not a helicopter. This was a node in a network, an executioner at the end of a system that saw everything. The infamous Highway of Death incident, where thousands of Iraqi vehicles were destroyed fleeing Kuwait, has been primarily attributed to Air Force jets. But the first and most devastating strikes came from Apache helicopters. An Apache pilot, call sign Rattler 22, later described the mission in a debriefing that was immediately classified. His battalion had been tasked with cutting off the retreat. Using night vision, GPS navigation, and thermal imaging, they intercepted the fleeing column in total darkness. The Iraqi vehicles, packed bumper to bumper, had no idea they were being hunted. The Apaches used a deliberate, methodical approach. First, they destroyed vehicles at the front of the column. Then they destroyed vehicles at the rear. The column was now trapped, unable to move forward or back. Then, for hours, the Apaches cycled through, rearming and refueling at forward bases, returning to systematically destroy every vehicle in the column. The pilot described it not as combat, but as target practice. The Iraqi vehicles had no way to fight back. They couldn't see their attackers. They couldn't hide. They couldn't escape. It was, he said, like shooting fish in a barrel, except the fish were on fire, and the barrel was 10 miles long. In Moscow, the analysis of DesertStorm arrived like a death sentence. The final classified report, compiled by the GRU's main intelligence directorate, was titled Assessment of Helicopter Operations in the Kuwait Theater. It was 400 pages long. Its conclusions could be summarized in a single sentence. The Soviet Union could not defend against American attack helicopters. The report detailed the problem in brutal technical terms. Detection failure. Soviet mobile radar systems, designed to track fast-moving jets, could not reliably track helicopters flying at low altitude. The helicopter's radar cross-section was too small, and they used terrain masking to hide from radar altogether. Engagement failure. Soviet mobile SAM systems were designed for targets moving in predictable paths at medium to high altitude. The Apache, hovering behind a hill and popping up only to fire, was an impossible target geometry. Range failure. The Hellfire missile outranged every weapon system in the Soviet ground forces inventory. Soviet tanks could not shoot back. Soviet infantry anti-tank teams had to be within 2 kilometers to engage. The Apache could kill from 8 kilometers. Network failure. Most damning of all, the report concluded that even if the Soviets developed equivalent helicopter technology, they could not replicate the American network. The Apache was powerful because it was plugged into AWACS, JSTARS, GPS, secure data link communications, and forward scouts. The Soviet military had no equivalent architecture. One passage from the report became infamous within Soviet military circles. The American attack helicopter is not a weapons platform. It is the visible manifestation of a completely integrated battle management system. We have been preparing to fight helicopters. We should have been preparing to fight an entire philosophy of warfare.
Despite the grim assessment, the Soviet military-industrial complex attempted to respond. The efforts were hasty, expensive, and ultimately futile. Countermeasure 1. The Super SAM. The SA-15 Gauntlet system was rushed into production, designed specifically to engage low-flying helicopters with rapid-fire missiles. But it was too expensive, too complex, and came too late. By the time it entered service, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Countermeasure 2. The Attack Helicopter Race. The Mi-28 Havoc finally entered limited service in the mid-1990s, after the Soviet collapse, and the KR-50 Black Shark introduced radical concepts like a single-seat design and ejection system. But both suffered from the same fundamental problem. They were designed as platforms, not as network nodes. Russia lacked the GPS, data link, and sensor fusion technology to make them as effective as the Apache. Countermeasure 3. The tank upgrade. Soviet engineers attempted to retrofit T-72 and T-80 tanks with roof-mounted defensive systems and improved thermal sights to engage helicopters. But these upgrades were expensive and only marginally effective. A tank, even with upgrades, could not see and engage a target 8 kilometers away, hiding behind a ridgeline. The investigation was a failure, because the investigators were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for a machine to copy, when they should have been looking at the entire invisible architecture of a new way of war. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the attack helicopter revolution was the human factor. Soviet pilots were trained in a rigid, top-down system. They followed orders from ground controllers. They executed pre-planned missions with little flexibility for adaptation. American Apache pilots were trained as autonomous hunters. They were given an objective and trusted to achieve it using their own tactical judgment. They operated in the dark, behind enemy lines, without direct communication with higher command, making life-or-death decisions in real time. This required a completely different type of soldier. The Apache pilot needed to be part fighter pilot, part tank commander, part infantry scout. They needed to read terrain like a sniper, understand armor tactics like a tanker, and navigate like a long-range reconnaissance specialist. The Soviet military-industrial complex could, eventually, copy the hardware. They could not copy the training culture that produced the men who flew it. The attack helicopter has continued to evolve since DesertStorm, but its fundamental role has remained unchanged. It is a terrain-hugging, ambush predator that sees everything, kills at range, and vanishes before counterfire arrives. Modern variants like the AH-64E Apache Guardian have added capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction in 1991. Apaches can now control MQ-1C Grey Eagle drones, using them as forward scouts and extending their sensor reach by hundreds of kilometers. Modern Apaches are nodes in the Joint All-Domain Command and Control Network, receiving targeting data from satellites, drones, F-35 jets, and ground sensors simultaneously. The Apache's avionics can conduct electronic warfare, jamming enemy communications and GPS. However, near-peer adversaries have learned from DesertStorm. Russia and China have invested heavily in countering attack helicopters, with advanced SAMs, counter-network warfare capabilities, and proliferation of modern, man-portable air defense systems. In February 2022, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine, they expected a rapid victory. They possessed numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and manpower. They had studied DesertStorm. They had prepared countermeasures. What they had not prepared for was the return of the ghost. Ukrainian forces, equipped with Turkish TB2 Bayraktar drones and American Javelin anti-tank missiles, implemented the same basic philosophy that the Apache had pioneered. See first, shoot first, from beyond the enemy's ability to respond. The TB2 drone, a fraction of the cost of an Apache, operated on the same principle: loiter, observe, strike with precision, vanish. The Javelin, a man-portable missile system, gave individual infantry soldiers the same capability that had once required a multi-million-dollar helicopter. Fire and forget, top attack, beyond visual range, tank killing. Russian armored columns, caught in the open on Ukrainian roads,
were destroyed with the same methodical precision as Iraqi columns on the Highway of Death 3 decades earlier. The weapon systems had changed. The philosophy had not. In a bunker somewhere in Moscow, perhaps a modern analyst sits before a computer screen, reading reports from Ukraine and experiencing the same chilling realization that Colonel Thieu felt in his Vietnamese cave and Marshal Yazov felt in his Soviet command center. The ghost is still hunting, and they still have no answer for it. The attack helicopter did not win the Cold War, but it was the visible proof that one side understood the future of warfare, while the other was still trapped in the past. It was not about who had more tanks or more soldiers. It was about who could see, who could strike, and who could adapt. The invisible predator that changed war forever was never just a machine. It was a mirror, reflecting back the fundamental truth that information is the ultimate weapon, and those who control it will always defeat those who merely react to it. The mystery of the attack helicopter is that it was never mysterious at all. It was inevitable. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq to the fields of Ukraine, the lesson remains constant. Warfare is not about the size of your army or the thickness of your armor. It is about the speed of your information and the precision of your strike. The attack helicopter was the first weapon system to fully embody this principle. It could see over hills. It could kill from beyond visual range. It could coordinate with satellites in space and scouts on the ground. It was not a flying tank. It was a flying computer, connected to a network that made every enemy movement visible and every friendly strike devastatingly accurate. The Soviets built helicopters. The Americans built a system. That was the difference. That is still the difference. And that difference decided the Cold War not with nuclear fire, but with the quiet hum of rotor blades in the night and the sudden, terrible precision of a missile that arrives from nowhere, guided by a network that sees everything. The Sky Devil, the invisible predator, the ghost that changed war forever.